Ever look around you and think, this is just backwards? What if instead it worked this way? In this podcast, we explore what it takes for people to reimagine the world around them and what stands in their way. How much boredom is the right amount of boredom to tolerate?
Listen, I'm really embarrassed to admit this, but I have not been bored since about 10 years old. I remember as a junior Boy Scout going to my mom in the backyard and saying to her, "There's nothing to do." And it was the middle of the summer, and she said, "Well, read a book or do some kind of carnival activity," which I often did during the summer.
These are the two options, right?
I did
in your
right.
childhood miss.
Yeah, there was a lot of carnivals. And
I have
the
this
list
great
must
image
have
of
been
you
longer.
diligently reading and then jumping in a Ferris wheel, and maybe both together, but go on.
No, but actually I just would watch TV. So sadly I did not have very good reading habits when I was younger, but I loved TV and had great TV watching skills. I always thought that instead of this SAT for college, there should have been the TAT, the Television Aptitude Test, the TAT, because no one should be allowed into a university unless they had basic cultural competency. And you can't have cultural competency unless you're watching mass media.
So I never would have gotten into college with your philosophy. My mother, as has been admitted in this podcast before, cut the cord of my TV when I was 9 with sewing shears. I can't believe I've never told you this. And so I also had to come up, my brother and I then spent the next few years in a paracosm, right? Made up worlds where we made up stories. But I would sit in art class in my high school. And this one kid would always start art class by saying, "Who saw Saturday Night Live?" And I had never seen Saturday Night Live. I didn't know a thing about American culture. I was like an exchange student.
Wow. Well, that's shocking. So no, my parents didn't cut the cord, but I'll tell you one influence that it had, which was Friday nights were my favorite shows. So I'm a little bit older, and on Friday night were The Wild Wild West, which I loved. It was like a Western secret agent show, and then followed by The Man from U.N.C.L.E. And the shocking thing was that there was nothing to record them with, so that when my mother would drag me off to temple, Jewish synagogue on a Friday night, I was furious because I was missing these great TV shows. Had there been recordings, I would have become a religious person. But the absence of recording technology meant that I'm an atheist, basically.
DVR would have had you in yeshiva, right?
Yeah,
It was
exactly.
just that. But wait, there's at least two problems here. One is I did the wrong thing when I said like an exchange student. Maybe in the 80s, that would have been fair, right? Not everybody had more than a couple channels in their country. But now, people from all over the world will make references, I don't know, to the characters in Seinfeld or Friends or something. It's really disturbing to me.
Right.
But wait.
But it's shocking, though. So this is a problem today because my latest reflection on our recent election, we won't get into politics deeply, but I'll just say that I have come to the reluctant conclusion that I don't know what most of the country is talking about, that I have not followed my own prescription of being in tune with mass media. So I am not watching the Joe Rogan show, and I am not looking at TikTok and all of the things that are going on in Instagram. And my kids who are plugged into this stuff, they know what's going on. And I'm not sure how much social change I can do until I figure out how I become tuned in.
This brings us full circle to boredom, right? Because I hate to tell you this, but I think you will go back to the boardroom of your 10-year-old memory if you have to watch TikTok.
Yeah,
I
probably,
could
or
be
three
wrong. Maybe it'll
hours
be
of a Joe
excitement
Rogan
all day.
interview.
Yeah, I don't know. But I still have to ask you this. And if you find this entertaining, you have my praise. But have you never had to wait in line to get a visa to another country? Have you never had to wait for 2 hours in the Chinese embassy on the West Side Highway in Manhattan? I mean, I could entertain myself in virtually any situation, but it is a faceless concrete building. You're in endless lines, and it, I guess, sure, I could imagine a lot of entertaining stuff, but there's something about that situation where even my imagination is like, nah, forget this. I'm not helping you here.
So there are frustrating situations like this, but when people are wasting your time, you still can find things to do with your time. So I would, on those lines, which I mean, I am on these lines, I play Words with Friends, which, as we have discussed, I started a club on Words with Friends called the
You're gonna be watching
Sapiotextuals.
TikTok also, but let's hear about the club.
Yeah, no, there are there are these clubs of 30 people who compete against one another internationally. There's tens of millions of people playing Words with Friends. It's a shocking number. But
Mm-hmm.
it's a nice way of meeting people and engaging with people. I've made friends actually with Words with
Mm-hmm.
Friends. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but I also carry around pieces of paper and I keep notes and when the time is free, I take advantage of it. So to use a very specific example that you just gave, I had to about 3, 4 weeks ago drive to Los Angeles. So I live in Palm Springs. Los Angeles is a 2.5 hour trip with traffic, 3.5 hours. I drove to Los Angeles round trip for what was a 10-minute meeting to renew my passport. It was an insane requirement, but I did it. What did I do during those hours? I caught up on phone calls. I had a little notebook next to me. I was writing down ideas for things to do next. It was fun. I enjoyed that time. I was not bored in the least.
Mm, Moose, you're a better person than I am. As what you've taught me today is that it's the voice inside me that would be so mad that I was driving for that 10-minute appointment, 3 hours, that then refuses to entertain myself. Like you've shown me, it's not that we can't come up, with a words with friends game and make new friends while doing words. Very impressive. It's that I'm mad, so my inner teenager is just not helping in those
Right. The
situations.
only thing that makes me mad are telemarketers. And also people who book appointments for doctors. And I try to be a better person for both of them, but I have failed miserably.
Yeah, yeah.
In
Or
fact, if it turns out that heaven is made up of telemarketers, I am in deep trouble.
you're assuming you're actually going to heaven. So I got to ask one more thing. What about a situation? Have you had to take an online training recently from a university that is designed to bore you and not let you do something else to entertain yourself? The video doesn't let you fast forward, even if you already know the answer. You have to watch it, and it's just hard enough, the question they ask, that you need to give it a little of your attention. Have you had to do one of these trainings? And if you have, how did you entertain yourself in that situation? And then, Mim, you got to clean this up for us because we're getting headed toward a very interesting place.
Well, the truth is that I have been putting off said training uh, for some unknown date, and I am now feeling very bad that you have reminded me of this. And
I wasn't referring to a specific training.
I suspect that that training will occur while I'm playing with my fish. So I have two goldfish to my right. They're my constant companions, and we will have endless, interesting conversation while I'm doing this training.
This is Moose Shuman, everyone. Even his goldfish are never bored. Do we have to really watch all these social media fads in order to stay in touch and make any change? Help us out with where we go from here, Miriam Plavin Masterman.
So thanks for such an easy assignment. Really appreciate that. That was great. Thanks for queuing that up for me.
No sweat.
I actually think it's very hard, given that we're so worried about being bored, to find places to look for information or stories or words that aren't things we're already used to. And I think as things get more overwhelming, as they get more chaotic, as even we get more polarized, we tend to shrink back further and just do the things that we know, the places we know, the sources we know, the information that we know, because we're so worried about being bored. Versus maybe we should try to challenge ourselves. Like I'm a big fan of this. I hate to say AI generated, but it kind of is. It comes out of MIT. It's a place for news, and I get an email from them every day with the facts of the day, and then they have the facts, and then they have the spin from one side and the spin from the other. But it's exposing me to places I would never go to get information. And even pointing out, well, all these places from all over the world, they all agree on these 5 facts. And I love that.
Let's talk about local responsiveness. I want to get into that. I want to hear from Moose Shuman about amazing local businesses, why this is more than just a cute idea, why this is possible everywhere, and what the economics of that are.
We're here today with Michael Shuman, aka Moose. He is an economist, he's an attorney, he's an author, he's an entrepreneur. He works diligently in community economics.
And at Words with Friends.
And at Words with Friends, that's true, fair point. He runs local economy programs for Neighborhood Associates Corporation. He teaches with Alejandro in Bard's business program. And he's done research for Council Fire and Local Analytics on economic development analyses for multiple levels, of including local governments, and states, and businesses around America. So he's co-authored or been architect behind legislation around crowdfunding and securities exchange. I mean, he's done so many amazing things. But we are going to spend some time today talking a lot about local responsiveness. And he has this book. Now, it came out almost 20 years ago, but a lot of the ideas are even more relevant today. The small mart revolution, how local businesses are beating the global competition. And so even though the book was 2006, there's a lot of information in there that is relevant today and a lot of new developments that make it even more meaningful.
I'm Alejandro Juarez Crawford, and this is my co-host, Mim Plavin Masterman. And we're on a mission to make coming up with solutions of your own, especially local ones, more normal than watching videos on your phone. Now, Moose has a different mission, which is to get to know all the videos in your phone. So let's dive in. Moose, tell us about an exciting local business, and why is this more than just a cute thing that we get to write articles about? Why is this important?
So let's start at a kind of big picture level, and I'll get to some of my favorite local businesses. It's like asking who's your favorite child, and if you mention one without the others, they're all going to hate you. So people believe that we are in this era of globalization, centralization, big government, big world order stuff, and they feel nervous as hell about these things that are out of their control. And what I try to point out to people is that small business, locally owned small business, medium scale locally owned business comprise 60 to 80% of the jobs in our economy. And these businesses are highly competitive. And actually, despite all of the hoopla about globalization, they are becoming more competitive. Now, not every business, not every sector, and we'll talk hopefully about, some of the sectors that are struggling. But I'll tell you, the sector that people usually think about when you talk about small businesses is retail, because that's where we encounter businesses in our day-to-day life. But at the end of the day, retail is about 7% of our economy, even though many more goods pass through retail. And it is true that because of Amazon and also before Amazon, the big box stores, local retail took a shellacking. So retail is a sector that has suffered greatly. But lots of other sectors are doing great. And the big picture is that there are trends in the global economy that are shrinking economies of scale. So there's so much to say here, and I'll try to not make this too jumbled. But one of the classes that I teach at our business program is economics, and when we get to the issue of economies of scale, what I try to remind students of is that they keep using a phrase like, well, we've got to scale our business, by
Mm-hmm.
which they mean to make it successful, it has to become bigger. And what I remind them is that whenever you use scale as a verb, you probably are using it incorrectly, because the theory of economies of scale is to find the right scale for the right mission,
Mm-hmm.
not the biggest scale. And there are things that improve economies of scale when you get bigger, and there are things that become diseconomies of scale when you get bigger. And what I would argue is that in our era, the diseconomies of bigger scale are becoming more and more profound. And here is, there's a bunch of trends that I can talk about that underscore why economies of scale, I believe, are shrinking worldwide. Here's just one, which is when I was a kid, so I was born in 1956, and the first few years of my life and my family, like a typical American family, the vast majority of things that we purchased as a family were goods, and services were about 30% of expenditures. Today, that is flipped. 70% of what we spend is on services, and services are everything from financial services, health services, information services, personal services. And most of us want a service provider who we actually have a relationship with, which
Mm-hmm.
touches many of the
So
points that you make. And
can we
and
actually pause here for a second
yeah,
and don't lose your next thought, because I want to tease out two things you brought up. And in fact, it's a tension. On the one hand, you're saying, actually, you want services that are responsive to you. They're local, they get you, they know you. And that's now most of what you spend money on. On the other hand, you talked about folks who assume that we need to scale. And when they say to scale, they don't mean to get the right scale. They mean to become like software, right? Where you can just have half the world using your product at supposedly negligible marginal cost. Okay. So I want to dig into this for a second from a very specific point of view. You're saying there is a master narrative that is dominating, even though it's not dominating in the real world. That's what I'm hearing. And can you help us think about why? So every entrepreneur has heard, okay, yeah, but wait a minute, but can it scale? I don't think entrepreneurs got obsessed with that because they all wanted to build Microsoft, right? Or whatever it is, OpenAI, whatever it is in the next iteration. I think they got obsessed with that because everyone kept asking them, can it scale? So can you tease out for us a little bit? Why is there this one reality where we have all this local growth, we want responsive services, everything you just said, and then this other master narrative that is so potent that it changes the way we present our businesses, and it actually changes what we attempt to do and what we invest our resources in?
there are lots of causes. One is the sort of fairly unique American perspective of looking for global solutions and global in a sense, conquest, global control. One of the things that I learned when I started traveling to Europe when in my 20s is that when I was a kid and played the game of Risk, the goal of Risk was global conquest. You had to take over the entire map. When you go to Europe and you play the game of Risk, the objective is to take over a continent, and then the game is over. And
Is this the
to
great powers history? You had to have your own sphere of
Yeah,
colonization. This is what we're doing.
exactly. So, and I thought this is so interesting because they they in Europe have perceived some limits to power based on a more sensitive appreciation that when you have global intentions, as say Germany did or Napoleon did, all hell breaks loose. And we have less of that appreciation in the United States. So, I mean, there is just this ideological piece. I think there's also this piece of neoclassical economics, and this begins to implicate Europeans and everyone else in the sort of cosmopolitan global class who believe in their hearts of hearts that bigger is better, larger economies of scale will deliver cheaper goods to people, and they forget that there's more to life than cheap stuff. So,
Wait. Hold on. You just said this crazy thing. What do you mean?
right, right. What could possibly be more? But when I was in law school, the guy who was teaching uh, uh, antitrust was named William Baxter, and he became Reagan's Justice Department antitrust representative, and he basically turned off all antitrust challenges except those that were increasing price. So that means that if the company was destroying communities or destroying unions or destroying local ecosystems because of its size or interfering with elections or undermining democracy, all of that was fine as long as it led to cheaper prices. And it's a nutty way of seeing the world. It's a nutty economic theory. But that is what flows naturally from the neoclassical vision that it's all about cheap goods. When you pay attention to the news, they'll give you what the, Dow Jones Industrial Average is. They don't give you the small business industrial average, even though that's far more important as an
Right.
indicator on the economy. Historically, economists would say, well, if a region is doing poorly and another region is doing well, people in the poor region should move to take jobs somewhere else. And if you look at the structure of, say, Department of Labor programs, this is what they're all about, is moving people from places that don't have jobs to places that do, rather than how do you create jobs in place. And the reason why they do that is that there is no value for the local DNA, for the DNA of place that's rooted in culture, music, family, traditions, and yet that is what people regard as really important in their lives.
And we call this privately pre-Copernican economics, right? It's this belief that what's really at the center, right, from the pre-Copernican idea that the Earth was at the center of the solar system or the universe. So what's so destructive about it, and I just want to make sure we pick up on how the false narrative actually affects things, is that all the time, once a company starts to attract capital, it is actually pulled out of the neighborhood in which it has thrived.
Yes.
Mim and I have examples from Andrew Yang when he was doing VFA to Jane Jacobs. There are all these examples of that. So, can you delve into us for? So, say we're convinced for a moment that the pre-Copernican economists might actually be full of baloney. Can we talk about why their narrative is so pervasive and what we might do about that?
So, one of the ways that we have gotten hooked in to this traditional narrative is through our investments. And it's worth pausing for a second and saying, even in a wealthy country like the United States, you can break down the population in roughly 3/3, okay? So there is 1/3 who are destitute, and the idea of investment is really just the idea of getting out of debt by the time you die. Uh, the second group at the top has savings in all kinds of investment vehicles, IRAs, 401ks. They invest individually in stocks and bonds. They buy second homes and so forth. And then you have a middle third who have minor savings in IRAs and 401ks, but really their biggest investment is in their house. And getting their home purchase and the sale of their home right is a critical part to their being retired and living okay for the rest of their lives. So when we talk about investment, really mostly talking about these 2/3 for which investment is relevant. But here's the thing, that even though 60 to 80% of our economy is rooted in local business, all, and I'm not exaggerating, all of people's investment is going into the 20 to 40% that is publicly traded large companies. And that is a shocking number, right? And I have done this experiment 1,000 times. Every time that I speak before an audience, I ask them by show of hands, how many of you have at least 1% of your investment portfolio in local businesses you love and care about? And there are no hands that go up. Now, the reason for this is not that people consciously don't invest in local businesses. It's that we have a structure of securities laws that was invented in the early Jurassic period that makes it really expensive for
That's even
grassroots.
before pre-Copernican ideas.
Pre-Copernican, yes,
Yeah.
I didn't go back to Cenozoic, but pre-Copernican, where in order to take a penny, for a local business to take a penny from a grassroots investor, that business would have to do $15,000, $25,000, $35,000 of disclosure work through a securities attorney to paper the transaction, which is nuts. Now, we've changed that, and we can talk about those changes. But the result of this, and we did this in order to protect grandma from buying swampland in Florida. That's the
Right.
refrain that we heard from securities lawyers. But the result is that all of us are over investing in the global companies we distrust. And all of us are under investing, that is, not investing at all, in the local businesses that we love. And despite our effort, despite this reality that we systematically have tried to destroy local businesses through securities laws that advantage big businesses, small businesses have done really well.
Yeah.
Imagine if we fix this, how much
Right.
better they would do.
You've put three big ideas on the table, Moose. One, actually, the action is in local business. Two, you want it to be. They're responsive to your needs, especially in services, but not only in services. Three, capital is skewing this. We are over investing. We're creating these bubbles. We're creating terrible products that drive what Mim and I call life in cattle class in our book upcoming. And then at the same time, we are often many small businesses that people love go out of business or can't invest in a machine and some people in some real estate or whatever it is that could help them do more of that thing we love. Those are the three big ideas I've heard so far. Can we get into a story or two that can really flesh this out for listeners, what you're describing?
Yeah. Well, so let's talk about the positive side of the ledger, which is that over the last 8 years, we have been operating under a different set of laws in the United States that allow grassroots investors to put money into local businesses in a much more affordable way. And we call this investment crowdfunding. And the results are pretty shocking that something like 2 million Americans have put $2 billion into 7,000 companies. The average company that has done investment crowdfunding has raised over $300,000, and the average investor has put in 1,000. And the most successful entrepreneurs have been women and people of color, the people historically excluded from capital markets. So I feel like that's a pretty good success story. And I could give you lots of very specific success stories about companies that have started to use this kind of way of raising capital and making a big difference. And actually, we're at a stage now where I feel like what's important to pay attention to is not the one-off investments that people are making locally, but rather the emergence of local investment funds that create well-managed pools of these securities at the local level so that you as an investor don't have to do quite as much work in finding and managing these securities. And so let me give you some examples of this. And again, big picture, there are 10,000 funds in the United States. If you ask the question, how many of those funds focus on local business or projects and are involving grassroots investors, the answer is about 30 or 40 of those 10,000. But there are some great ones out there. So the Ujima Fund in Boston, uh, it is a fund that is run by the communities that it's involved in, which are Roxbury and Dorchester, very distressed communities in Boston. They have $10 million that they put into local businesses, and it is overseen by a committee, an investment committee of community members. Great design. There is a fund called the Evergreen Fund in Montana that buys businesses that are the heart of Main Street, like a big hardware store in a small town of Montana. And that if that store goes under because there's no succession plan, the town goes under. So they help to buy the store and then resituate the ownership in people living there. The real advantage of companies that grow deep in place is they are not competitive with other companies in other places that grow deep in place. Whereas empire builders, global empire builders, are jealous about their trade secrets. Local businesses are not. So back in the year 2010, I got some money from the Kellogg Foundation and from the Gates Foundation to do a study that was called Community Food Enterprises. I think that was the name that we used. And we looked at 24 models of competitive local food enterprises, half in the United States, half internationally, and tried to tease out what were their competitive advantages. And we could talk about that, but there was an unexpected finding in the study, and that was that every one of the businesses we looked at had correspondent relationships with similar businesses internationally. So great restaurants had other great restaurants that they were talking to 10,000 miles away. Great grocery stores were connected to other great grocery stores. Poultry operations were connected to other poultry operations. And so you have this network, this vast web of communication among small business proprietors where they learn from one another and they share their little secrets because they're not so important to keep too close to their vest. And in some cases, they collaborate with one another. So, for example, if they do need to compete in order to get, supplies at a cheaper level and the supplies aren't available local, well, they can create a producer co-op that then enables them to purchase those supplies with the same kind of discount that their global competitors get. So, to me, what this suggested is that there is a whole nother framework for globalization,
Mm.
both on the business creation side and also on the problem solving side. And if you can start creating a more successful web of these enterprises, all of the crap that is happening among national governments and among bigger businesses, it is going to slowly wither away.
Where's the demand side coming from if we're making sure that these businesses have backing to offer their products and services?
Right. So this is really this is a it's an important question because it gets at a fundamental misunderstanding in economic development. Economic developers believe that wealth is generated when big global companies set up factories, usually manufacturing factories, in someone's backyard and then produce goods that are exported worldwide. And, there may be some competitive advantage that big manufacturers have. But we go back to my observation about how we're spending our money. And because we've moved into a service oriented economy, even a place like Burlington can easily provide all of its services, all of that 70% for itself. So even a 50,000 person
Mm.
community has enough diversity within it to provide nearly all of those services in a competitive way. And when you're talking about the goods, the other 30% of what we spend our money on, two-thirds of that, that is 20% of our expenditures, are on what are called uh, non-durable goods. Non-durable goods are things like food that we consume a lot or building materials. The thing about non-durable goods is that they weigh a lot, and unlike microchips, they have a low dollar value per unit weight. It does not make sense to ship food all around the planet because food is mostly water. The point is that as it becomes more expensive, especially when you add in carbon costs to transport heavy things around the planet,
Mm.
we're going to have more robust local and regional food systems, local and regional material systems. There still are some things out there that you can't produce locally in Burlington. But my point is that you can do about 90% of what people actually consume in a competitive way within any given region of the planet.
Part of the challenge for us living in this era of these massive companies that offer us everything is we have this idea that more choices are always better. And so in these small communities or small local economies, you don't have 20 options for something, you have four. And so there's this sense of relative deprivation. It's not real, right? You still have choice, you just don't have as much choice. But I think we've come to value this idea that like everything is always available. Like I can eat fruit all year round, even if it's not in season, if it's flown in. When really in Europe, they're like way better about this. They're like, these are the things that are in season and this is what we're eating. So it feels like quite a mindset shift to get people to be okay with that different way of consuming. Do you know what I'm asking?
Can
Yeah, yeah. Well,
you first,
but
man?
but just be aware they are already doing this different way of consuming. I mean, it's when I say that 70% of what people spend is on services, that's not hypothetical, and that most of it is local is not hypothetical. That is what is happening. Now, you're right that people want more choices, and maybe I don't like the three piano teachers in Burlington, and so I'll go to Boston for a piano teacher. All right, that happens, and the internet maybe will make this easier to happen. So there's some leakage, that happens because of technology. But there's also technologies, and this starts to get into a whole nother topic. There are technologies that are also decentralizing business, right? Like 3D printing really is a technology that is highly decentralizing. When I talk about collaboration of small businesses, some of that collaboration is over what are their choices of technology. So if I have figured out a clever way of creating a village scale wind system, it's no cost to me, and actually it feels pretty good to share that technology with other communities around the world. And so when communities can collaborate and share the best of what they have developed with one another, we move much faster as a civilization to getting to where we want to go.
I really, there's this illusion that we're choosing between the best from everywhere. But
Right,
there are at
right.
least three kinds of poison built into that illusion.
Yeah.
One is that the fruit isn't local, so it's either very expensive or it's old and it's ripened in a truck and it lost its flavor, right? Secondly, the second kind of poison is it's actually killing us en masse, right? The major diseases in industrialized countries are linked to processed food. You can't even argue anymore that that's not the case if you look at the data on it. So it's not just the piece of fruit, right? It's that when we get into all those choices, we inevitably are adding more processing to the menu, right? And then the third kind of poison is in some ways the most insidious, which is that remember those services you talked about, which are 70% are responsive, then it leads certain kinds of entrepreneurs to try to replace the responsive services in our life with automated services that are just good enough until we realize that they're empty and we don't even know why we're so angry, so unsatisfied, so lonely, right? We replace the intimacy of local relationships with the transactional realities of everything from just watching canned videos online to online intimacy itself, which unfortunately can be a surrogate, but not one that satisfies people.
What's important to tease out here is that we're not talking about communities pulling back into themselves and just withdrawing from the world.
Mm-hmm,
We're
mm-hmm.
talking about communities engaging with the rest of the world from a position of strength, where they share their best ideas and achievements and learn from others their best ideas and achievements.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and this it's just a very different paradigm for constructing the economy and constructing politics.
I would say to take your point even further to what I believe is its logical extension, that we don't get the ideas and achievements unless we build the local ecosystem.
Yeah,
That right? There's no there's no New York pizza without some people using the local water, right? There's a thousand millions of examples of this, but it's not just the local water; it's the local interactions that come up when you're eating international cuisine. You come to appreciate these foods that are just incredible. But those foods came from rich local traditions. That's why they're incredible. They didn't just get made up by food scientists, right? So my point is that Moose, you've said there's all this interaction, and that I'm arguing that the things we come to value, from cuisine to even the ways in which we make a pair of shoes or something, that if we want to keep filling those aquifers, we need the local interactions.
I mean, I when I articulate what are the principles for creating a prosperous local economy, I emphasize 4 points. One is to maximize the percentage of jobs in locally owned enterprise, which means changing the structure of many businesses so that those businesses are owned by people in the community. That could be done through everything from LLCs to co-ops, even to the extent that nonprofits have some form of local participation. Second piece is to have a diversified economy, which means a resilient and relatively self-reliant economy. And this goes against all of the teachings of David Ricardo, except David Ricardo, in his assumptions, made clear that what we're trying to do in global trade doesn't work right now. It's a
Tell
whole
our
other
listeners
discussion.
what David Ricardo's core idea that got us to treat a theory as if it were a fact.
Yeah, so David Ricardo is the architect of comparative advantage, and he postulated that you had Portugal producing wine and England producing cloth, and if they could trade with one another and each specialize in what they did well, they would both be better off. And it's a very compelling theory. But he also said that if it were the case that workers could not move from England to Portugal, but capital could move, that you would have all the capital moving to Portugal where the wages are lower, and England would become destitute.
Wait. But let's tease out what you just said. Okay, so for listeners who haven't taken a macroeconomics class, everyone who takes economics in most universities gets taught comparative advantage. And they get taught the very reductive conclusion that if you're better at making wine than cloth, you should only make wine and trade it for all of your cloth. And what you've already brought out in this conversation, Moose, is that one thing we lose from that is cool local things that we do with cloth. We lose local wine, for goodness sake. Who just wants to drink wine from one region in the world because they're so good at making wine? It doesn't even add up.
And not only that, what we learned in COVID is that those communities that had more rigorously embraced the comparative advantage theory of economic development were the biggest losers, because there are times where resilience and local self-reliance are really important. So this is why, I say to communities, you really want to figure out what you're not doing that you should be doing in your community, where are the leaks of dollars happening, and that gives you insight about how to create new or expanded local businesses. Just to quickly go through the list, the third point is on social metrics of business, which is what we teach in our program around community, environment, governance, and so forth, that we want businesses that not only produce good profit, but actually are good to all the stakeholders. And then the last point is about entrepreneurship and innovation, which is what you teach, Alejandro. And I think that is always important to keep front and center. That the difference between a failing local economy and a good local economy is that a good local economy learns from innovation all over the world and it becomes innovative itself from that learning.
Can you give us a story or an example as we close out about how, when you allow things to flourish locally, and you've made the point that they're resilient, they flourish anyway, right? But when you stop trying to make it so hard by subsidizing these unresponsive large scale models, that there's some magic that happens in terms of how they respond to our needs and how they lead to this thriving and flourishing economy.
So I'll give you an example that is more on regulation than on the economy itself, but I think it's a powerful lesson. And my first nonprofit was called the Center for Innovative Diplomacy. It lasted for about 10 years. And we built a network of mayors and city council members mostly in the United States, but around the world, that were getting involved in international affairs. And somewhere around 1987, my colleague then, a guy named Larry Agron, mayor of Irvine, who, by the way, was just reelected as mayor of Irvine for the 150th time, Larry decided to declare a treaty-making event in Irvine, and it invited Canadian and American mayors to come together for what he called SPA, the Stratospheric Protection Accord. And it was all about reducing the emissions of halons and chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, into the environment. So all these cities had businesses, whether they were dry cleaners or other manufacturers that had these substances. And so there were city mandates for these businesses to clean up their act. This this got a lot of attention. The State Department was kind of mad that we were involving Canadian cities in treaty making, but there was really nothing they could do about it. But it ultimately ripened into the Montreal Protocols that took what these cities did, what they began with in their backyard, and took it universal. And to me, we talk so much about NIMBY, not in my backyard. I think the better expression is BIMBY, begin in my backyard. And so begin with doing it right for your businesses and doing it with innovative businesses.
Moose, what you've shown me today is that it's not just in the old phrase, otro mundo es posible, right? Another world is possible. It's that another world is here.
It's here. Just
It's
wake
already
up to
here.
it.
We just need to
Yeah.
wake up, notice it, and stop making it so impossibly difficult for everyone who's creating something amazing in local soil. Thank you so much, Moose Shuman. What a great pleasure having you on What If.
Thank you. Appreciate it.